I'm a millionaire and my father forced me to marry a gardener. My family laughed at me, but they didn't expect that. I never thought my life would change so drastically in a single day. But then again, I never really thought about much beyond my next party or which exotic car I'd drive that week. That was just how life was for Ethan Blackwood, son of billionaire real estate mogul Victor Blackwood, at least until that fateful spring morning when my father summoned me to his study. I remember sauntering in, fashionably late as usual, my designer sunglasses perched on my head despite the early hour. The study always seemed too stuffy, too serious, much like my father himself. He sat behind his massive mahogany desk, fingers steepled, a look of determination etched on his face. "Ethan," he began, his voice grave, "we need to talk about your future." I rolled my eyes, preparing for another lecture about responsibility and legacy. But what came next was so unexpected, so outrageous, that for once in my life I was rendered speechless. "I want you to get married," he stated matter-of-factly. "For 1 year." I burst out laughing. "Good one, Dad. What's next? You want me to get a real job too?" His expression didn't change. "I'm serious, Ethan. And yes, eventually that too." The laughter died in my throat as I realized he wasn't joking. Married for a year? To whom? To Clara Thompson. The name didn't ring a bell, which was strange considering I prided myself on knowing every eligible socialite in our circles. "Who's Clara Thompson?" My father's lips twitched, almost forming a smile. "She's our gardener." I was sure I had misheard him. "The gardener? You want me to marry the help?" "Clara is a hard-working young woman with ambitions beyond tending our gardens. She's putting herself through college, studying environmental science, and she's been taking care of her sick mother." I shook my head in disbelief. "This is insane. Why would I agree to this? Why would she?" "Because, Ethan, it's time you learned some responsibility. As for Clara, I've offered to pay for her mother's medical treatment and fund the remainder of her education." The pieces started falling into place. "So it's a business deal. Think of it as an arrangement beneficial to all parties involved." I paced the room, running my hands through my hair. "And what if I refuse?" My father's gaze hardened. "Then I'll cut you off. No more credit cards, no more cars, no more penthouse. You'll have to make it on your own." The threat hit me like a bucket of ice water. Make it on my own. I'd never worked a day in my life. The thought terrified me more than I cared to admit. "This is blackmail," I muttered. "This is an opportunity, Ethan. An opportunity to grow up and become the man I know you can be." I slumped into a chair, my mind reeling. "Does she know about this crazy plan?" "I spoke with her this morning. She's agreed to meet with you to discuss the terms." Of course she had. Who wouldn't jump at the chance to marry into one of the wealthiest families in the country, even if it was just for a year? "Fine," I said finally, more out of a lack of options than any real agreement. "I'll meet her." My father nodded, satisfied. "She'll be in the garden this afternoon. Don't keep her waiting." As I left the study, I felt like I was walking in a daze. How had my life taken such a surreal turn? Me, married to the gardener. It was like something out of a bad romance novel. I spent the next few hours trying to wrap my head around the situation. By the time afternoon rolled around, I had convinced myself that this was all some elaborate joke. Surely, when I went to the garden, my friends would jump out from behind the topiaries, laughing at how they'd managed to prank the unprankable Ethan Blackwood. But as I stepped onto the manicured lawn, the only person I saw was a young woman kneeling by a flower bed, her hands deep in the soil. She looked up as I approached, shielding her eyes from the sun. "Mr. Blackwood?" she asked, standing up and dusting off her hands on her jeans. "Ethan," I corrected automatically. "You must be Clara." She nodded, a tentative smile on her face. "Your father said you'd be coming to talk." I took a moment to really look at her. She wasn't what I expected. There was a quiet strength in her posture, a spark of intelligence in her eyes. Her skin was tanned from working outdoors, her brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wasn't glamorous by any means, but there was something genuine about her. "So," I began, unsure how to broach the subject, "I guess we're getting married." Clara's smile faltered slightly. "Your father explained the situation to me. I want you to know that I'm not doing this lightly. My mom, she needs this treatment, and finishing my degree, it would change everything for me." I felt a twinge of something, guilt maybe, at her words. Here I was, complaining about having to give up my lifestyle, while she was trying to save her mother's life and create a better future for herself. "Look," I said, running a hand through my hair, "this isn't exactly how I pictured getting married either. But if we're going to do this, we might as well try to make it work, right?" She nodded, her expression serious. "I agree. Your father mentioned we'd need to live together to make it believable. I hope that won't be too uncomfortable for you." I almost laughed. Me, uncomfortable. I was Ethan Blackwood. I thrived on pushing boundaries and living on the edge. But something in her earnest gaze stopped me. "We'll figure it out," I said instead. "So, when do you want to do this?" "Get married, I mean. Your father suggested next week. He wants to have a small ceremony here in the garden." Next week. The reality of the situation hit me all at once. In just 7 days, I'd be a married man. The thought made my head spin. "Ethan," Clara's voice pulled me back to the present. "Are you okay?" I plastered on my most charming smile, the one that usually got me out of any sticky situation. "Never better. Just thinking about what to wear to my own wedding." She laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to brighten the garden around us. "Well, I guess that makes 2 of us." As we stood there in the dappled sunlight, surrounded by the flowers Clara had so carefully tended, I realized that my life was about to change in ways I couldn't even begin to imagine. Part of me was terrified, but another part, a part I hardly recognized, was intrigued. Who was this woman who had agreed to marry a stranger for the sake of her family? And more importantly, who would I become in the process? As I walked back to the house, leaving Clara to her gardening, I couldn't shake the feeling that this year would be unlike any other in my life. Whether that was a good thing or not remained to be seen. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything I thought I knew about myself, about love, and about what truly matters in life. The week leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of preparations and paperwork. My father, ever the pragmatist, had his lawyers draw up an ironclad prenuptial agreement. Clara and I signed it without much fanfare. After all, this was a business arrangement, not a love match. On the day of the ceremony, I found myself standing in the garden, surrounded by a small gathering of family and close friends. The spring air was crisp, filled with the scent of blooming flowers. It should have been romantic, I suppose, but all I felt was a gnawing sense of unreality. I adjusted my tie for the 100th time, trying to ignore the pitying looks from my friends. They thought I was being forced into this, and in a way I was. But I couldn't bring myself to explain the whole situation. It was too humiliating. And then I saw her. Clara walked down the makeshift aisle between the rose bushes, and for a moment I forgot to breathe. She wasn't dressed in some over-the-top designer gown, but in a simple white dress that seemed to catch the sunlight. Her hair was down, falling in soft waves around her shoulders. She looked beautiful. As she reached me, I saw the nervousness in her eyes, the slight trembling of her hands as she held a small bouquet of wildflowers. In that moment, I felt an unexpected urge to reassure her. "You look amazing," I whispered as she took her place beside me. A small smile played on her lips. "You clean up pretty well yourself, Mr. Blackwood." The ceremony was mercifully short. We exchanged rings and vows, promising to love and cherish each other, words that felt hollow given the circumstances. But as I slipped the ring onto Clara's finger, I was struck by how right it looked there. The reception that followed was a subdued affair, nothing like the wild parties I was used to throwing. I found myself constantly aware of Clara's presence beside me, her hand resting lightly on my arm as we greeted guests. She played the part of the blushing bride perfectly, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes. As the evening wore on, I overheard snippets of conversation from the guests. Most were speculating about our sudden union, with theories ranging from the scandalous to the absurd. I caught more than one person eyeing Clara with barely concealed disdain, clearly wondering how a mere gardener had managed to snag one of the most eligible bachelors in the city. The urge to defend her took me by surprise. I found myself pulling her closer, shooting warning glances at anyone who dared to look at her the wrong way. Clara seemed oblivious to it all, too focused on maintaining her composure in this unfamiliar world of wealth and privilege. Finally, as the last of the guests departed, we were left alone in the grand foyer of the mansion. The silence between us was deafening. "So," I said, attempting to break the tension, I guess we're married now. Clara nodded, twisting the new ring on her finger. I guess we are. Look, I know this isn't ideal for either of us, I began, feeling the need to say something, anything. But I want you to know that I'll do my best to make this year bearable. She looked up at me, her eyes searching my face. I appreciate that, Ethan. And I want you to know that I'm grateful for what your family is doing for me and my mother. I promise I won't get in your way or expect anything from you that isn't part of our agreement. Her words should have reassured me, but instead they left me feeling oddly hollow. Right. The agreement. We stood there awkwardly for a moment before Clara spoke again. I should probably go get my things. Your father said I could move into one of the guest rooms. I'll show you, I offered, more out of a need to do something than actual helpfulness. As we walked up the grand staircase, I couldn't help but notice how out of place Clara looked in this opulent setting. Her simple white dress seemed to glow against the dark wood paneling and rich carpets. She trailed her hand along the banister, a look of wonder on her face. I've worked here for 2 years, she said softly, but I've never been in this part of the house before. I felt a pang of something, guilt, shame, at her words. How many times had I passed her in the garden without a second glance? How many parties had I thrown while she tended to the flowers outside? We reached the guest wing, and I opened the door to what would be Clara's room. It was spacious and elegantly furnished, with a view of the gardens she loved so much. I hope this will be comfortable for you, I said, suddenly feeling like a host rather than a reluctant husband. Clara stepped into the room, her eyes wide. It's beautiful. Thank you. An awkward silence fell between us. What were we supposed to do now? How did one act on their wedding night when the marriage was nothing more than a carefully orchestrated charade? Well, I said, backing towards the door, I'll let you get settled. If you need anything, just ask one of the staff. Clara nodded, a flicker of something, relief, disappointment, crossing her face. Good night, Ethan. Good night, Mrs. Blackwood, I replied, the name feeling foreign on my tongue. As I closed the door behind me, I leaned against the wall, letting out a long breath. What had I gotten myself into? This wasn't like my usual impulsive decisions, a spontaneous trip to Paris, a risky investment, a whirlwind romance. This was my life for the next year. I made my way to my own room, my mind churning with thoughts of the day. As I loosened my tie and kicked off my shoes, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. The man staring back at me looked the same. Perfectly coiffed hair, designer suit, the very picture of a privileged playboy. But something felt different. For the first time in my life, I was responsible for someone else's happiness, someone else's future. The weight of that responsibility settled on my shoulders like a physical thing. As I lay in bed that night, sleep eluding me, I couldn't help but wonder about the woman sleeping just down the hall. Who was Clara Thompson, really? What dreams and ambitions lay behind those earnest eyes? And how would this year change both of us? Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything I thought I knew about love, about commitment, and about myself. As I finally drifted off to sleep, one thought echoed in my mind. This year was going to be unlike any other in my life. Whether that was a blessing or a curse remained to be seen. The first few weeks of married life were, to put it mildly, awkward. Clara and I danced around each other like wary cats, careful not to invade each other's space or disrupt the delicate balance we'd established. We'd see each other at breakfast, exchange polite small talk, and then go our separate ways. Me to my usual routine of leisure and social engagements, her to the gardens or her classes. It was during one particularly lazy afternoon that my father cornered me in the library. I was sprawled on a leather couch, mindlessly scrolling through my phone when he walked in, his face set in that all-too-familiar look of disappointment. "Ethan," he said, his voice level but stern, "this isn't what we agreed upon." I sat up, defensive. "What are you talking about? I married her, didn't I?" He sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "The point of this arrangement was for you to learn responsibility, to grow up. But you're still living the same way you always have. What do you expect me to do?" I snapped. "Take up gardening." To my surprise, a small smile played on his lips. "That's not a bad idea, actually." And that's how I found myself the next morning, standing in the middle of the vast gardens, feeling completely out of my element. Clara was already there, kneeling by a flower bed, her hands covered in dirt. She looked up as I approached, surprise evident on her face. "Ethan, what are you doing out here?" I shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of how ridiculous I must look in my designer clothes among the plants. "I thought maybe I could help. You know, with the gardening." Clara's eyebrows shot up. "You want to help? With gardening? Is that so hard to believe?" I asked, a hint of defensiveness creeping into my voice. She stood up, brushing dirt from her knees. "Honestly, yes, but if you're serious, I could use some help with the new rose bushes." For the next few hours, Clara patiently showed me how to plant the delicate rose bushes. It was hard work, far more challenging than I'd anticipated. The sun beat down on us, and soon I was sweating through my expensive shirt. But there was something oddly satisfying about digging my hands into the earth, about carefully placing each plant and patting the soil around it. As we worked, Clara talked about the different types of roses, her voice animated with genuine passion. I found myself listening, actually interested in what she had to say. It was a far cry from the vapid conversations I was used to at social events. "You really love this, don't you?" I asked during a water break. Clara nodded, her face flushed from the work but her eyes bright. "It's more than just a job to me. There's something magical about nurturing life, about creating beauty from nothing but soil and seeds." I looked out over the garden, seeing it with new eyes. The carefully arranged flower beds, the manicured lawns, the elegant topiaries, all of it was a testament to Clara's dedication and skill. "I never really thought about it before," I admitted. "It was just there." She smiled, a hint of sadness in her eyes. "Most people don't. They see the end result but not the work that goes into it. It's like that with a lot of things in life, I guess." Her words struck a chord in me. How much had I taken for granted in my life? How much beauty and effort had I overlooked? As the days passed, I found myself spending more and more time in the garden with Clara. At first, it was out of a sense of obligation, a way to appease my father. But soon, I began to look forward to our time together. There was something soothing about the work, something grounding about getting my hands dirty and seeing the tangible results of our efforts. Clara was a patient teacher, never mocking my mistakes or my lack of knowledge. Instead, she encouraged me, praising my efforts and gently correcting my technique. Under her guidance, I learned to tell the difference between beneficial insects and pests, to prune roses for optimal growth, and even to design simple landscaping plans. One evening, about a month into our marriage, we sat on the patio after a long day of work. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the gardens. Clara was animatedly describing her plans for a new butterfly garden, her hands gesturing as she spoke. I found myself mesmerized, not just by her words, but by her passion, her dedication. "You know," I said, interrupting her mid-sentence, "I think I'm starting to understand why you love this so much." She paused, looking at me curiously. "Oh," I nodded, struggling to put my feelings into words. "It's like you're creating something, not just flowers or plants, but a whole ecosystem. It's beautiful." A slow smile spread across Clara's face, lighting up her eyes. "That's exactly it, Ethan. I'm glad you can see it too." In that moment, something shifted between us. It wasn't dramatic or earth-shattering, but it was there. A new understanding, a bridge across the vast gulf that had separated us. As we sat there in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn from gold to pink to purple, I realized that something was changing within me too. The restlessness that had always driven me to seek the next thrill, the next party, the next distraction. It was quieter now. In its place was a strange sense of contentment, of purpose. That night, as I lay in bed, my muscles aching from the day's work, but my mind oddly at peace, I thought about the person I'd been just a month ago. The Ethan who scoffed at the idea of manual labor, who saw the garden as nothing more than a backdrop for parties. That Ethan seemed like a stranger now. I wasn't naive enough to think that a few weeks of gardening had completely transformed me. My old habits, my old life, they were still there, lurking just beneath the surface. But for the first time, I could see the possibility of something different, something more. As I drifted off to sleep, the scent of roses lingering on my skin, I couldn't help but wonder what other changes this year might bring. What other parts of myself might I discover, hidden beneath the carefully cultivated image I'd maintained for so long? Little did I know, The seeds of change planted in those early weeks would soon blossom into challenges and revelations I could never have anticipated. The garden was just the beginning of a journey that would test not only my newfound appreciation for hard work, but also my understanding of relationships, responsibility, and what it truly means to grow. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself settling into a routine I never thought possible. Mornings in the garden with Clara, afternoons split between helping her and tentatively exploring my father's business, and evenings spent in quiet companionship on the patio. It was a far cry from my previous life of endless parties and reckless indulgence, but to my surprise, I didn't miss it as much as I thought I would. That is, until the day Jake showed up. Jake Russo had been my best friend since college, my partner in crime in every wild adventure and scandalous escapade. He was the last person I expected to see strolling across the manicured lawn one sunny afternoon, designer sunglasses perched on his perfectly coiffed hair. "Ethan, my man," he called out, arms spread wide. "What's this I hear about you playing farmer?" I straightened up from the flower bed I'd been weeding, suddenly acutely aware of my dirt-stained jeans and sweaty t-shirt. "Jake, what are you doing here?" He grinned, that same mischievous smile that had gotten us into and out of so much trouble over the years. "Rescuing you from this green prison, of course. Come on, grab a shower. We're hitting the town tonight." I hesitated, glancing over at Clara, who was pretending not to listen as she pruned a nearby rosebush. "I don't know, Jake. I've got responsibilities now." Jake's eyebrows shot up. "Responsibilities? Who are you and what have you done with Ethan Blackwood?" He lowered his voice conspiratorially. "Look, I get it. You're stuck in this sham marriage for a year. But that doesn't mean you have to become a monk. One night out won't kill you." His words struck a chord. Wasn't this exactly what I'd been afraid of when this whole arrangement began? Losing myself, losing my freedom. And yet, "Let me think about it," I said finally. "I'll call you later." Jake shrugged, already turning to leave. "Sure thing. But remember, the Ethan I know never needed to think twice about a good time." As I watched him saunter away, I felt a familiar itch, a restlessness I thought I'd left behind. Clara's voice pulled me back to the present. "You should go," she said softly. I turned to her, surprised. "What?" She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's okay, Ethan. This arrangement, it doesn't mean you have to give up your whole life. Go out with your friend, have fun." I studied her face, trying to decipher the emotions hiding behind her carefully neutral expression. "Are you sure?" Clara nodded, turning back to her roses. "Of course. I'll see you tomorrow." That night, as I stood in front of the mirror adjusting my tie, I barely recognized the man staring back at me. Gone was the dirt under my fingernails, replaced by the gleam of my Rolex. My gardening clothes were swapped for a tailored suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. As I slipped out of the house, I caught a glimpse of Clara through the window, curled up on the patio with a book. For a moment I hesitated, but then Jake's words echoed in my mind, and I squared my shoulders. One night out wouldn't change anything, right? The club was exactly as I remembered, pulsing music, flashing lights, beautiful people everywhere. Jake greeted me with a shot of top-shelf tequila, and soon we were right back in our old rhythm. Dancing, drinking, flirting. It was intoxicating, this return to my old life. As the night wore on, I found myself at the bar, chatting with a stunning blonde, who kept touching my arm and laughing at my jokes. It was familiar territory, the kind of interaction I'd navigated 1,000 times before. But something felt off. "So," she purred, leaning in close, "your place or mine?" I blinked, suddenly very aware of the ring on my finger. I can't. I'm married." She raised an eyebrow, clearly undeterred. "Honey, half the men in here are married. That doesn't have to stop us from having a good time." For a moment I was tempted. It would be so easy to fall back into old patterns, to be the Ethan Blackwood everyone expected me to be. But as I opened my mouth to reply, an image flashed in my mind. Clara, alone on the patio, waiting for me. "I'm sorry," I said, standing up abruptly. "I have to go." I found Jake in the VIP section, surrounded by a group of giggling models. "I'm heading out," I shouted over the music. He looked at me like I'd grown a second head. "What? The night's just getting started." I shook my head. "Not for me. I need to get home." Jake's eyes narrowed. Don't tell me you're actually falling for this whole marriage charade. Come on, Ethan, this isn't you. His words hit me like a physical blow. This isn't you. But who was I, really? The party boy who could drink all night and charm any woman he wanted? Or the man who found peace in a garden and contentment in quiet evenings with Clara? Maybe it is me, I said quietly. Maybe I'm changing. I left Jake staring after me, confusion and disappointment etched on his face. The cool night air hit me as I stepped out of the club, clearing some of the fog from my head. Without thinking, I found myself directing the driver back to the mansion. It was late when I arrived home, the house dark and quiet. But as I approached, I saw a figure silhouetted on the patio. Clara. She looked up as I approached, surprise evident on her face. "Ethan, you're home early." I sat down beside her, loosening my tie. "Yeah, the party scene isn't really my thing anymore, I guess." Clara studied me for a moment, her eyes searching my face. "Are you okay?" I leaned back, looking up at the stars. "I don't know. I thought going out, being my old self, I thought it would feel good, but it just felt empty." She was quiet for a long moment. Then, hesitantly, she placed her hand on mine. "Change isn't easy, Ethan. But that doesn't mean it's bad." I looked down at our hands, then back at her face. In the soft moonlight, she looked different somehow. Not the plain gardener I'd dismissed all those months ago, but a woman of strength and depth. "Thank you," I said softly, "for waiting up, for understanding." Clara smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her whole face. "That's what friends are for, right? Friends." The word should have felt like a step backward, given that we were supposed to be married, but somehow it felt like progress, like something real in the midst of our arranged charade. As we sat there in comfortable silence, the stars twinkling above us, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I was starting to figure out who the real Ethan Blackwood was. And surprisingly, I liked him better than the man I used to be. Little did I know this night was just the beginning of a series of challenges that would test my newfound resolve, pushing me to decide once and for all who I truly wanted to be. The weeks following my night out with Jake were a period of introspection. I found myself reevaluating everything I thought I knew about myself, my life, and my place in the world. The garden, once just a backdrop to my privileged existence, had become a sanctuary of sorts. It was there, among the roses and hydrangeas, that I felt most at peace. One particularly warm afternoon, as Clara and I worked side by side in the vegetable patch she had convinced my father to allow, I decided to broach a subject that had been on my mind. "Clara," I began, wiping sweat from my brow, "I've been thinking about getting more involved in the family business." She looked up from the tomato plants she was tending, surprise evident on her face. "Really? That's unexpected." I chuckled, understanding her skepticism. "Trust me, I'm as surprised as you are, but I can't keep living in this bubble forever. And if I'm honest, I'm curious about what my father actually does all day." Clara sat back on her heels, studying me with those perceptive eyes of hers. "What brought this on?" I shrugged, struggling to put my feelings into words. "I guess I want to contribute something, to be more than just the rich playboy son." I paused, then added softly, "I want to be someone you can be proud to be associated with." The moment the words left my mouth, I realized how true they were. Somewhere along the line, Clara's opinion of me had become important. More than important, it mattered in a way few things ever had. A soft smile played on her lips. "Ethan, I'm already proud of how far you've come, but if this is something you want to do for yourself, I think it's a great idea." Encouraged by her support, I approached my father the next day. To say he was shocked would be an understatement, but once he realized I was serious, he agreed to let me shadow him for a week. That week was eye-opening. I sat in on meetings, pored over financial reports, and for the first time truly understood the scope of the Blackwood empire. It wasn't just real estate. We had interests in sustainable energy, urban development, even a budding tech division. But it wasn't all positive. I also saw the ruthless side of business, the backdoor deals, the strong-arm tactics, the disregard for environmental concerns in favor of profit. It left a sour taste in my mouth. On the last day of my shadowing experience, I found myself in a heated argument with my father over a proposed development that would destroy a local wetland. "It's not right, Dad," I insisted, my voice rising. "That wetland is home to endangered species. not to mention its importance in preventing flooding in the area. My father's eyes narrowed. Since when do you care about endangered frogs, Ethan? This deal could net us millions. Maybe there are more important things than money, I shot back, surprising even myself with my vehemence. A tense silence fell between us. Then, to my shock, my father's stern expression melted into a proud smile. You know, you remind me of your mother right now. She always had a soft spot for lost causes. The mention of my mother, who had passed away when I was young, caught me off guard. I do? He nodded, his eyes distant with memory. She would have loved to see you like this, passionate about something that matters. He sighed, then fixed me with a serious look. All right, let's table the wetland development for now, but I want you to come up with an alternative proposal. If you care about this, prove to me it's worth caring about. I left his office in a daze, my mind reeling from the unexpected turn of events. As I made my way through the mansion, I found myself drawn to the garden, seeking out the one person I knew would understand. I found Clara in her favorite spot, a secluded bench surrounded by a riot of colorful blooms. She looked up as I approached, her smile fading as she caught sight of my expression. Ethan? What's wrong? I collapsed onto the bench beside her, the events of the day tumbling out in a rush. Clara listened patiently, her brow furrowed in concentration. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, You know, I think I might be able to help with your alternative proposal. I looked at her puzzled. How? Well, she began, her eyes lighting up with enthusiasm, I've been studying sustainable urban development in my classes. What if, instead of destroying the wetland, we incorporated it into the development? Create a nature preserve, maybe an educational center. It could be a unique selling point for the project, and it would preserve the ecosystem. As she spoke, outlining her ideas with growing excitement, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about impressing my father or being a better person. This was about making a real difference, about using the privilege and power I'd been born into for something good. Clara, I said when she paused for breath, you're brilliant. She blushed, ducking her head. It's just an idea. No, it's more than that, I insisted. It's a vision for what our company could be, what I could be. In that moment, looking at Clara's flushed face and bright eyes, I felt something I'd never experienced before. It wasn't the fleeting attraction I was used to, or even the fondness I'd developed for her over the past months. It was deeper, more profound. Before I could examine the feeling too closely, Clara stood up. Come on, she said, holding out her hand. Let's go work on that proposal. As I took her hand, letting her pull me to my feet, I realized that our arranged marriage had become something neither of us had anticipated. We were partners now, in more ways than one. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Clara and I worked tirelessly on the proposal, blending her environmental knowledge with my growing understanding of the business world. We spent long nights hunched over laptops, surrounded by papers and empty coffee cups. It was during one of these late-night sessions that it happened. We were debating the finer points of wetland restoration when I looked up and caught Clara's eye. She was gesticulating passionately, her hair a mess, a smudge of ink on her cheek. And in that moment, she was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Without thinking, I leaned in and kissed her. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. Then Clara pulled back, her eyes wide with shock. Ethan! Reality came crashing back. What had I done? This wasn't part of our arrangement. This wasn't supposed to happen. I'm sorry, I stammered, already backing away. I shouldn't have... I'll go. I fled the room, leaving Clara standing there, her fingertips pressed to her lips. As I retreated to my room, my mind in chaos, one thought kept repeating. What happens now? Our carefully constructed world had just been turned upside down, and I had no idea how to right it. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same again. The days following the kiss were a strange dance of avoidance and tension. Clara and I continued to work on the proposal, but the easy camaraderie we'd developed was replaced by awkward silences and stolen glances. I wanted to talk about what had happened, to understand what it meant, but every time I tried to broach the subject, the words died in my throat. It was Clara who finally broke the stalemate. We were in the garden, ostensibly discussing the integration of green spaces into our development plan, but the conversation was stilted, professional. Suddenly, she set down her tablet and turned to face me. "Ethan, we need to talk about what happened." I felt my heart rate spike. "Clara, I'm so sorry, I shouldn't have—" She held up a hand, cutting me off. "No, let me speak, please." She took a deep breath, her eyes meeting mine with a determination that both thrilled and terrified me. "That kiss, and it wasn't just you. I felt something too." Her words hung in the air between us, charged with possibility. I hardly dared to breathe. "You did?" Clara nodded, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "I've been trying to ignore it, to stick to our arrangement. But the truth is, somewhere along the way, my feelings for you changed. And I'm scared, Ethan, because this isn't what we agreed to. This isn't why I'm here." I reached out, taking her hand in mine. "Clara, But before I could continue, a voice interrupted us. "Well, isn't this cozy?" We both turned to see Jake standing at the edge of the garden, a sardonic smile on his face. I dropped Clara's hand as if it had burned me, guilt and anger warring inside me. "Jake, what are you doing here?" I asked, standing up. He sauntered closer, his eyes flicking between Clara and me. "I came to see if my best friend had completely lost his mind." "Looks like I have my answer." I felt Clara stiffen beside me. "I should go," she murmured, already starting to retreat. "No, stay," Jake said, his tone deceptively light. "I'd love to hear how our little gardener managed to ensnare the great Ethan Blackwood. Is the sex that good, or is it the thrill of slumming it?" Fury rose in me, hot and fast. "That's enough, Jake. You need to leave. Now." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Come on, Ethan. Wake up. This whole thing is a joke. You really think she cares about you? She's using you just like you're using her. It's a business deal, remember?" I saw Clara flinch at his words, and something inside me snapped. Before I knew what I was doing, my fist connected with Jake's jaw. He stumbled back, shock registering on his face before it twisted into anger. "You've changed, man," he spat, "and not for the better." As he stormed off, I turned to Clara, my hand throbbing. She was staring at me, her eyes wide. "Ethan." But whatever she was going to say was cut off by the arrival of my father, his face a mask of concern. "What's going on here?" I just saw Jake leaving in quite a state. I looked between my father and Clara, feeling the weight of expectations and unspoken truths pressing down on me. In that moment, I made a decision. "Dad, Clara, I think it's time we all had an honest conversation." An hour later, we were seated in my father's study. The tension in the room was palpable as I took a deep breath and began to speak. "Dad, I know you arranged this marriage to teach me responsibility. And Clara, I know you agreed to it for your mother's treatment and your education, but things have changed. I've changed." I looked at Clara, drawing strength from her steady gaze. "I'm not the same person I was when this started. Working in the garden, getting involved in the business, developing our proposal, it's shown me a different way of living. A better way." My father leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "What are you saying, Ethan?" I squared my shoulders. "I'm saying that I want to continue working on sustainable development projects. I want to use our resources to make a real difference. And—" I hesitated, then plunged ahead. "And I want to see where things go with Clara, not because of an arrangement, but because I care about her." The silence that followed was deafening. Clara was the first to break it. "Ethan, I don't know what to say. My mother's treatment, my education, those things don't have to change," my father interjected, surprising us both. He looked at me, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. "Ethan, when I proposed this arrangement, I hoped it would teach you responsibility. I never imagined it would lead to this level of personal growth." He turned to Clara. "Your agreement with us stands, regardless of what happens between you and Ethan. Your mother's care and your education are not conditional on this marriage." I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. "So, you're okay with this?" My father chuckled. "Okay with my son wanting to contribute meaningfully to the family business and potentially finding genuine happiness?" "I think I can live with that." Clara still looked shell-shocked. "But what about the agreement? The year of marriage?" I took her hand, ignoring my father's raised eyebrow. "I say we throw out the rule book. Let's see where this goes, for real this time. No pretenses, no arrangements, just us." A slow smile spread across Clara's face. I'd like that. As we left my father's study hand in hand, I felt like I was stepping into a new world. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in my life, that uncertainty didn't scare me. It excited me. We walked to our spot in the garden, the place where so much had changed over the past months. As we sat on the bench, surrounded by the beauty we had nurtured together, Clara turned to me. You know, when I agreed to this arrangement, I never imagined this is where we'd end up. I laughed, pulling her close. Life has a funny way of surprising us, doesn't it? She nodded, resting her head on my shoulder. So what happens now? I looked out over the garden, then back at the woman beside me. Now, we keep growing, together. As the sun set over the mansion, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, I realized that this was just the beginning. We had challenges ahead, integrating our lives, navigating the business world, dealing with societal expectations. But for the first time, I was ready to face those challenges head-on, because now I wasn't just Ethan Blackwood, heir to a fortune. I was Ethan Blackwood, partner, visionary, and a man in love, and that made all the difference in the world. The months that followed our decision to pursue a genuine relationship were a whirlwind of emotions and challenges. Clara and I were navigating uncharted waters, trying to balance our growing feelings with the practical realities of our lives. Our sustainable development proposal had been green-lit by the board, much to my father's surprise and delight. Suddenly, I found myself thrust into the role of project lead, a position I was both excited and terrified to fill. Clara, with her environmental expertise, became an integral part of the team, and together we threw ourselves into the work. It was during one particularly stressful week, as we were finalizing plans for the wetland preservation area, that the first cracks in our newfound bliss began to show. "Ethan, we can't cut corners on the water filtration system," Clara insisted, her voice tight with frustration. "It's crucial for maintaining the ecosystem balance." I ran a hand through my hair, exhaustion clouding my judgment. "I know, Clara, but the budget's already stretched thin. We need to make some compromises." Her eyes flashed with disappointment. "I thought you understood the importance of doing this right. Or was all that talk about making a real difference just lip service?" Her words stung, more than I cared to admit. "That's not fair. I'm trying to balance environmental concerns with business realities, something you don't seem to grasp." The moment the words left my mouth, I regretted them. Clara recoiled as if I'd slapped her. "I see," she said, her voice cold. "Well, Mr. Blackwood, I'll leave you to your business realities then." She stormed out of the office, leaving me feeling like a complete jerk. It was our first real fight, and I had no idea how to fix it. That evening, I found myself wandering the gardens, seeking solace in the place where our relationship had first blossomed. To my surprise, I found my father there, admiring a bed of newly bloomed dahlias. "Woman troubles?" he asked, a knowing smile on his face. I sighed, sinking onto a nearby bench. "Is it that obvious?" He chuckled, taking a seat beside me. "Son, I've been married for 30 years. I know that look." For a moment, we sat in companionable silence. Then, hesitantly, I asked, "How do you do it, Dad? Balance business with everything else?" My father was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. "It's not easy," he finally said. "Your mother and we had our share of fights over the years, especially when the business was just taking off." I looked at him, surprised. My parents' relationship had always seemed so solid, so unshakable. "How did you get through it?" He smiled, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "We remembered why we fell in love in the first place, and we learned to compromise, not just in business, but in life." He turned to me, his gaze serious. "Ethan, Clara challenges you in ways no one else ever has. Don't let your pride get in the way of that growth." His words resonated deeply, and I knew what I had to do. I found Clara in her room, surrounded by environmental impact reports and architectural drawings. She looked up as I entered, her expression guarded. "Clara, I'm sorry," I began, my heart pounding. "You were right. We can't compromise on the important things, not if we want to make real change." She studied me for a long moment, then sighed. "I'm sorry too. I know you're under a lot of pressure. I shouldn't have accused you of not caring." I moved closer, taking her hands in mine. "You keep me honest, Clara. You challenge me to be better. I never want to lose that. A small smile tugged at her lips. Even when I'm being stubborn, I laughed, pulling her into an embrace. Especially then. As we held each other, I felt the tension of the past few days melt away. We still had a lot to learn about balancing our personal and professional lives, but I was committed to figuring it out. Together. The next morning, energized by our reconciliation, we tackled the water filtration problem with renewed vigor. Clara proposed an innovative solution that would actually save money in the long run, while I leveraged my business contacts to secure additional funding for the project. It was a breakthrough moment, not just for the development, but for us as a couple. We were learning to blend our strengths to push each other to greater heights while still supporting one another. As the project progressed, word began to spread about the Blackwood Corporation's foray into sustainable development. Environmental groups that had once protested our projects were now cautiously optimistic. Business journals praised our innovative approach. Even Jake, who had been avoiding me since our confrontation, reached out with a grudging message of congratulations. But with increased visibility came increased scrutiny. One evening, as Clara and I were leaving a community meeting about the wetland project, we were ambushed by a group of reporters. "Mr. Blackwood, is it true that your marriage to Ms. Thompson was originally arranged by your father?" "Ms. Thompson, how do you respond to allegations that you married into the Blackwood family for financial gain?" The questions came rapid fire, each one more invasive than the last. I felt Clara stiffen beside me, her hand tightening in mine. For a moment, I was transported back to my old self, the Ethan who would have basked in the attention, who would have played up the scandal for the cameras. But I wasn't that Ethan anymore. I turned to face the reporters, my voice calm but firm. Our personal life is just that, personal. What matters is the work we're doing to create sustainable, environmentally responsible developments. If you'd like to discuss that, we'd be happy to schedule an interview. As we pushed through the crowd to our waiting car, I heard Clara let out a shaky breath. "You okay?" I asked, concerned. She nodded, a determined glint in her eye. I knew there would be challenges when we decided to go public with our relationship. But I'm not ashamed of how we started, Ethan. Look at where we are now, what we're accomplishing together. Her words filled me with a warmth that had nothing to do with the unseasonably hot evening. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" She smiled, leaning into me as the car pulled away from the curb. "We have, and we've still got a long way to go." As we drove home, the city lights blurring past the windows, I thought about the journey we'd been on. From an arranged marriage born of ulterior motives to a partnership built on mutual respect, shared goals, and genuine love. It hadn't been easy, and I knew we'd face more challenges in the future. But looking at Clara, her face illuminated by the passing streetlights, I knew that whatever came our way, we'd face it together. We were no longer just husband and wife, in name only. We were partners in every sense of the word, growing and changing together, nurturing not just a garden or a business, but a future we both believed in. And that, I realized, was the greatest growth of all. As the seasons changed and our first year of marriage drew to a close, Clara and I found ourselves standing at a crossroads once again. The wetland development project was nearing completion, garnering praise from environmental groups and business leaders alike. Our relationship had deepened, weathering storms both personal and professional. But the question that loomed over us was undeniable. What next? It was a crisp autumn morning when we decided to take a walk through the garden where our journey had begun. The trees were ablaze with red and gold, and a light mist hung in the air, giving everything a dreamlike quality. "Can you believe it's been a year?" Clara mused, her hand warm in mine. I shook my head, marveling at how much had changed. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that my father dropped his marriage bombshell. Other times it feels like a lifetime ago. We stopped by the rose bushes we'd planted together, now flourishing with late-season blooms. Clara reached out to touch a petal, her expression thoughtful. "Ethan, what happens when the year is up? Legally, our arrangement will be over." The question hung between us, heavy with implications. I took a deep breath, gathering my courage. "Clara, I've been thinking about that a lot lately, and I realized something important." She turned to face me, her eyes searching mine. "What's that?" I took both her hands in mine, my heart pounding. I realized that I don't want our story to end just because some arbitrary timeline is up. What we have, what we've built together, it's real. It's more than I ever thought possible. Tears welled up in Clara's eyes, but she was smiling. I feel the same way, Ethan. But where do we go from here? In that moment, everything became crystal clear. I knew exactly what I wanted, what felt right. Slowly, I lowered myself to one knee, never breaking eye contact with the woman who had changed my life in ways I never could have imagined. Clara Thompson, will you marry me? Not because of an arrangement or a business deal, but because I love you. Because I want to spend the rest of my life growing with you, challenging each other, and building a future we can be proud of. For a heart-stopping moment, Clara was silent, her eyes wide with surprise. Then, with a laugh that was half sob, she nodded. Yes, Ethan. Yes, I'll marry you, for real this time. As I slipped the ring onto her finger, a simple, elegant design with a small emerald that reminded me of her beloved garden, I felt a sense of rightness settle over me. This was where we were meant to be. The news of our engagement spread quickly. My father was the first to congratulate us, his eyes suspiciously moist as he hugged Clara and clapped me on the back. Your mother would have been so proud, he whispered, and I felt the weight of his words, of the legacy we were continuing. The next few months were a whirlwind of activity. We decided to have our wedding in the garden, the place where our love had first taken root. As we planned, we also worked on expanding our sustainable development initiatives. The success of the wetland project had opened doors, and we were determined to push for even greater change. It wasn't all smooth sailing, of course. There were still moments of tension, times when our different backgrounds and perspectives clashed. But we had learned to navigate these challenges together, to listen and compromise without losing sight of our shared goals. One particularly memorable moment came when we visited Clara's mother in the hospital. Her treatment had been successful, and she was recovering well. As we sat by her bedside, she took our hands, her eyes bright with unshed tears. When you first told me about this arrangement, she said, looking at Clara, I was so worried. I didn't want you sacrificing your happiness for me. Her gaze shifted to include me. But seeing you two together now, I realized that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the most unexpected beginnings. Her words stayed with me, a poignant reminder of how far we'd come. Finally, the day of our wedding arrived. The garden was transformed, draped in flowers and twinkling lights. As I stood at the altar, waiting for Clara, I thought back to our first wedding. The awkwardness, the uncertainty, the feeling of being trapped. How different things were now. When Clara appeared walking down the aisle on her mother's arm, my breath caught in my throat. She was radiant, her dress simple yet elegant, adorned with small flowers that matched the garden around us. But it was the joy in her eyes, the love shining from her face, that truly took my breath away. As we exchanged vows, real vows this time, promises made from the heart, I felt a sense of completion. We were no longer two people bound by an arrangement, but two souls choosing to intertwine their lives, their dreams, their futures. The reception that followed was a joyous celebration, filled with laughter, dancing, and heartfelt toasts. Even Jake was there, having come around to see the positive changes in my life. As Clara and I swayed together on the dance floor, surrounded by friends, family, and the garden that had witnessed our journey, I leaned in to whisper in her ear. "Thank you," I said softly. She pulled back slightly, her brow furrowed in confusion. "For what?" I smiled, drinking in the sight of her. "For taking a chance on me. For helping me grow into the man I am today. For loving me, flaws and all." Clara's eyes shimmered with tears as she cupped my face in her hands. "Oh, Ethan, we grew together, and we'll keep growing every day for the rest of our lives." As the night wore on and our guests began to depart, Clara and I found ourselves back in our favorite spot in the garden. The air was filled with the scent of night-blooming flowers, and the stars twinkled overhead like 1,000 tiny promises. "So, Mrs. Blackwood," I said, wrapping my arms around her, "what's next for us?" Clara leaned into me, her head resting on my chest. "Well, Mr. Blackwood, I was thinking we could start by revolutionizing the way corporations approach environmental responsibility. Maybe create a foundation to fund sustainable initiatives worldwide. Oh, and perhaps plant a few more gardens along the way." I laughed, my heart swelling with love and pride. Ambitious as always, I wouldn't have it any other way. As we stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, I marveled at the journey that had brought us to this moment. From an arranged marriage born of ulterior motives to a union forged in love, respect, and shared purpose, we had grown in ways neither of us could have anticipated, nurturing not just a garden or a business, but a love that would continue to bloom for years to come. Looking out over the garden that had been the backdrop to our story, I realized that life, like nature, has a way of surprising you. Sometimes the most beautiful flowers grow in the most unexpected places, and with the right care, patience, and love, even the most unlikely beginnings can blossom into something truly extraordinary. As Clara and I walked hand in hand back towards the house, towards our future, I knew that our story was far from over. It was, in many ways, just beginning. And I couldn't wait to see what would grow next.